not only in the election year, but also the 222nd year of the founding of our Constitution. It's the most wonderful legal document that was ever made. And so it was time to recall and rethink about some of the things that the Constitution tells us. So I'm calling on a man that I am most knowledgeable about the Constitution of anybody I know, and it's John Thompson. And before he comes to speak, I'd like to read a little bit of his bio. John Thompson earned degrees in finance and economics and served 20 years in the United States Marine Corps, retiring at the rank of major. He worked as an intelligence officer and counterintelligence officer. He was a stockbroker for 15 years and owned a chain of dry cleaners in San Diego. He also has degrees in math and physics and an MBA in human resource management. He taught college-level economics for 6 years. He's passionate about our country and our Constitution. He started 2 conservative groups and has been very active with local Tea Party activities. He is now working on a book called The Bible and Government Principles, and he's here to share some of the insights that he has. Thank you, John, for coming from Atwater to be with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to come here tonight into your facility and share some of my thoughts and opinions with you. A lot of what I have to say tonight may be construed in some circles as emotionally charged and very controversial, but somehow I feel that amongst this group, I don't think we're going to have a lot of disagreement. But nonetheless, I hope also that, I really hope that I don't teach you anything new. Now, you may not think of an instructor or a speaker coming to tell you that, but it's my hope that you already know enough about government, civics, and our Constitution that you just represent the better educated of our society. So what I hope I can do is simply take those pieces of information that you're already familiar with and connect them together in new ways for you. My parents taught me that it is impolite to ever discuss sex, religion, or politics amongst proper people. And you all do look like proper people. So I'm going to obey my parents for a few minutes, and let's talk about some more secular things like sports and music. Now, we just heard a nice piano rendition. Who was the pianist? How many hours of schooling did you have to learn the piano?
I don't know.
Can I assume, is there anybody who maybe was a piano teacher? You taught piano? Okay. So if you had a good student, how many hours a day would you expect a piano student to practice?
Maybe an hour.
An hour a day for, say, 5 days a week? For how many years? 10 years? Okay, so an hour a day for 5 days. Let's assume you're off weekends. That would be, let's say, 50 weeks a year. That'd be 250 hours in a year of piano practice times 10 years. That's 2,500 hours of piano practice. Does that sound about reasonable? And after 10 years at an hour a day, would you then be a concert pianist? Maybe. Okay. Okay, so it kind of depends, but it's probably not enough to prepare you to make a living as a pianist. Let's look at sports then. Is there anybody here who used to coach basketball, football, athletics? Okay, what sport did you coach, sir? Soccer. Okay, how many hours a week would your team have to practice? A day, or a week, or a month? 2 hours a day. Can we assume 5 days a week for just the soccer season, which would be what, 4 months? So after 10 years of this, how many total cumulative hours of soccer practice would somebody have had? 500 hours? Easily, 1,000 hours? What would be the consequences of investing 2,500 hours of your life, or 1,000 hours practicing the piano, or 1,000 hours practicing football, baseball, sports, and let's say after all that practice, all those extra hours in the batting cage and extra hours of special coaching, let's say you ended up a lousy pianist or a lousy soccer player. What would be the consequences to society? There wouldn't be any. Let's assume that you are a graduate of one of our high schools, and after 12 years of high school, your total education in civics had come to about 36 hours of government and civics. That's about what our high school graduates get, is about 36 hours of civics. And then you go out into the world as a voter, and you're not educated about government or civics, how our government works, and how to analyze issues. What then would be the consequences of being an ill-informed electorate? Could be significant. So it looks like we have our priorities all backwards. Throughout my talk tonight, I'm going to refer to these four institutions. Now, these four institutions are the institutions that are identified in the Bible. I suppose you could put tribe in there, but let's just associate tribe with family. Individual, family, church, and government. And we're going to talk about, well, let me tell you, what I wanted to do as I prepared for this was take these four institutions, individual, family, church, and government, and put them on a mobile to show how they're all balanced and interconnected. So I started with my PVC pipe, making a mobile, and I just couldn't come up with anything that communicated my concept to you just the way that I wanted to. So for the sake of simplicity and time here, we're going to envision balance between these four institutions. So I told you I'm going to help you connect the dots. If we look at every dot here as a fact, something that we all know and something that we all agree on, and I were to give you these facts and ask you, if you were to connect the dots, what would you see? What conclusion would you come to if I showed you these dots? Mickey Mouse. Well, maybe that's a good secular way of looking at connecting the dots. But that's not what the artist had in mind. You see, the artist's intent was for you to look up here and see a flock of geese. Here's the geese. And over here is a cloud. And this is a tree. Now, do you see what the artist intended for you to see? What I'm going to do is give you, maybe repeat back some things that you already know, but I'm going to connect them in a little bit different way that I hope will give you a new way of looking at things, at our government. So, as we talk about these four institutions, let's start at the bottom and talk first, and probably primarily, about government. What is the purpose of government? Any volunteers?
Serve the people.
To serve the people. And how would the government serve the people? Protection. Excellent. And what would they be protecting? What would the government be protecting? Protect us from enemies, so it's protecting ourselves, our rights. So really, I would agree with those two things. Protect our property and our rights. Okay, well now let's look at government. What I have prepared here is actually about 20 hours of information on biblical principles of government. I should tell you some of my sources. One of my resources is an agency just north of here in Modesto called the Institute for Principal Studies. Anybody heard of it? Kind of a conservative think tank run by a gentleman named Mike Winters, who's actually prepared a 20-hour block of instruction, and I would love to come and teach all of this to you at some point. Maybe we can talk about that in the spring. I've also taken material tonight from a book called Confrontational Politics. And so I'm merging all this into about 45 minutes. So understand that this is a broad subject, and I'm really condensing it. So briefly, as we talk about forms of government, there are an infinite number of types of government that go from total government. This wedge here represents total government, 100% government, and down here we have no government. What is a government where there's no government called? Anarchy, right. Anarchy or chaos, exactly. And what's a total government called? A dictatorship, excellent. So I know I'm not teaching you anything new. Dictator or a king or a pharaoh, a Caesar, any of those are total government. So in a totalitarian government system, the king owns all of the land. All of the deer are his, all of the rabbits are his, anything that's grown on the land is his. Now, in its truest sense, a kingdom really doesn't exist. It never really did, because every king actually has his close circle of advisors. Maybe they're czars or Caesars or his SS or his inner circle of counselors and advisors. So really, most governments are what's called an oligarchy. And that's ruled by a few, or a committee, or a team. Generally, a government is complicated enough that it takes more than one person. If we go down a little bit less now and take more power away from the government and give more power to individuals, the next form of government would be called a democracy. And people think of that as majority rules. Right? So what form of government do we have here in the United States? A democracy, I hear? What? It's a republic. We have a republic. Now, so we're hearing some controversy here. We're going to have a little disagreement, and that's okay. Let me share with you some of the differences. Say it. Hold on. Right, I agree that we're a republic. In a dictatorship or a kingdom, all the decisions are made by typically very few, or really one. In an oligarchy, decisions would be made by a few people, to a crowd, a committee, a select group, usually a percentage of the population. In a democracy, rule is generally by the mob. When I say mob, I differentiate that by majority, because in a true democracy, the winds may change with the seasons, and that majority, that 51%, could change their minds on a whim. A republic is a rule of law, and an anarchy really is ruled by nobody. A true anarchy never exists either. Occupy Wall Street's folks, they think of themselves as anarchists, but in reality, what I hear them chanting is, this is what democracy looks like, and they think of themselves as democracy, but I've looked at their website a lot and watched them a lot, and I realized they're really an oligarchy, because there's a small central group that manages the masses. So I would put Occupy Wall Street folks in actually some chaotic place between total lawlessness and oligarchy. But I would say they're anything other than a democracy. Certainly far from a republic. So let's continue here. An oligarchy is ruled by few, ruled by mob, ruled by nobody. How about, let me make sure that I don't stray too far from my notes. How do they rule? Let's see, a king rules by edict. He simply has to say the word, and it's so. A committee generally makes better decisions than individuals. So in an oligarchy, you would expect better decisions to come out. In a kingdom, you'd expect quicker decisions to be made. In a democracy, let me describe how a democracy may work. We're out on the range in western New Mexico, and a couple of cows have 2 brands on them. So somebody says, well, there's a cattle rustler out here, and you're the closest cowboy. So I ride back to town, grab a posse, we come out and confront that cowboy and say, we think you're a cattle rustler. Throw a rope over the tree, and everybody shouts, hang him, hang him, hang him. And by golly, up he goes, and that's the end of the cattle rustler. That's democracy. Mob rule. Now, under a republic, I would go back to town, round up the posse, bring the sheriff out, we'd arrest that cowboy, take him back to town, try him, given the facts, under a court of law, under the rule of law, compare his actions to what the law says are the necessary rules of evidence and so forth. And then we would decide his guilt or innocence. And then we may still throw a rope over a tree and hang him high, but at least he's been tried in a court of law. In an anarchist environment, it would never really work because as soon as you go out to do some fishing, somebody's going to be stealing stuff from your hut. You can't really go out and garden or till or plow because you've got to be back making sure that your stuff isn't stolen. So a real anarchy in government can't exist because as soon as you get a couple of families together and we say, okay, today I'm going to go farm and you watch our stuff and you go fish, well, we've just elected a sheriff and we've got this type of a government. And then to thank you for watching our stuff from those other marauding tribes, I'm going to give you some of the fish that I caught, and she's going to give you some of the apples that she's picked. So we've got a basic government at that point. Almost all animals in the animal kingdom survive that way. You know, prairie dogs group in families, and a couple of the prairie dogs will be up on their hind legs looking for predators. Did you know that I've read that scientists are actually studying trees in the rainforest, and they believe that some trees, once they're invaded by a particular parasite, give off a pheromone to fight that parasite, and the pheromone goes to the forest, alerts other trees that then build the proper defense to fight that, to fight that invader. So in a sense, some trees are sophisticated enough to group into essentially a little government. So the government exists to protect our property and to protect our rights. So as Hope introduced me earlier, she mentioned I was a counterintelligence officer, and I suppose it would be good for me to describe a little bit about that because I'm going to ask all of you basically to be counterintelligence people here tonight. An intelligence officer in the military is one who looks at this is an active intelligence now. It looks at the enemy, and we look at the enemy's strengths and weaknesses, their capabilities, their vulnerabilities, so that we can exploit those vulnerabilities. Well, a counterintelligence officer is one that counters the enemy intelligence efforts. So what we do is we look at what the enemy may see about us and looks at how we can strengthen ourselves, what we want to know what the enemy thinks our key vulnerabilities are. And we would want to either mislead the enemy or protect our weaknesses. So with the military counterintelligence mindset, I'm going to talk to you about government. So are you ready to hear how I weave all this tale together? Well, when I talked about democracy, quite a few people said, oh yeah, we're a democracy here in the US. Did you know, as you probably realize, that Cuba is a democracy, and it was a democracy that elected Fidel Castro. Just last week, Hugo Chavez was elected again by popular vote as essentially dictator of Venezuela. I think it's now his 12th year. Do you know how Adolf Hitler came to power? He was popularly elected in a democracy. Germany of 1914 was a democracy, and that's what put Hitler in power. So now let me ask, do you want to live in a democracy? I want to live in a republic. If you had your choice of any form of government, what would it be? Everybody's saying republic? I disagree with you. If I were given a choice, I would rather live in a kingdom, exactly. Provided that the king was a true benevolent king, that he was just, that he allowed me to shoot any deer or rabbit and eat it. He allowed me to grow whatever I wanted, and I could keep it, or eat it, or store it, or trade it. If he was a true benevolent king that truly loved his subjects and protected me and my rights, that's the kind of kingdom that I would want to live in. Unfortunately, any government controlled by man is going to be corrupt. Greed sets in, power, people want more and more. So that perfect government, that perfect kingdom doesn't exist here on earth. So when we look at our founding fathers, do you suppose that they knew all about this? I suggest that they did. Here's what we know. Here's what I think. I'm putting words in our founding fathers' mouths now. I mentioned that the benefit to a dictatorship is speed of decision making. You don't need any committee, you don't need any discussion, decisions are made. But better decisions come out of a team of learned people who can discuss and debate and come out with the best guidance or best rulings. The big advantage to a democracy is it appeases the people. Everybody feels like they've had a vote. So if 49% of the people vote for somebody other than Hugo Chavez becomes the dictator, they go, well, at least I voted, I'll go along with the majority now. But we're a republic. But when our founding fathers created our republic, I think they were divinely inspired. Because if you can all see my small writing here, this is what they gave us. They gave us a republic with, and I'll read this to you for those of you in the back, an executive branch, a judicial branch, and a legislative branch. Do you see the parallel between a king, a dictator, somebody who can issue rapid edicts, and our executive branch? And does it logically follow that a judicial branch is essentially an oligarchy, a team of learned people who we expect to make better group decisions? And the legislative branch, that body that is supposed to be responsible for making our laws, they're the group that is, we would assume, democratically elected. So our founding fathers were able to take all the best elements of all of these forms of government and combine them into one document. And our entire U.S. Constitution is only 4 pages long. Compare that with the health care bill. So our executive, our president, his job is to preside. The judicial branch is to interpret the law, and the Senate is to, or the legislative branch is to legislate. Now, for the purposes of comparison here, I'm going to break legislative branch into 2 groups, the House and the Senate, because in many cases, they have some significant differences. Let's look first at their term of office. How long is the president in office? 4 years. Maximum of 8, okay. How about our Supreme Court? How long are they in office? For life, long time. Until they die or quit. U.S. senators, 6 years, and our legislators, 2 years. Now we're going to see some patterns here. How do each of these people come into power? That is, are they elected or appointed? The president? Elected? I disagree. He's appointed by the Electoral College. The Electoral College has votes for the president and the vice president, but the Electoral College need not necessarily go with the popular vote. There's going to be a total of 1,174 votes cast for president and vice president, and the Electoral College could conceivably vote for one off of each ticket. I don't think they've ever done that, but the president really is appointed. And our founding fathers wanted it that way. Now this is a whole other topic, and I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on it, but if we did not have appointed officials, then basically California, New York, Florida would be the only states that the candidates would even bother to politic in or campaign in. And those people from Idaho to Arizona, their voice would not ever be heard. So there are some advantages to the Electoral College. How about judges, our judicial system, our Supreme Court? They're appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate. The Senate, how about them? How did our founding fathers intend for it to be? Exactly. Our Senate are appointed, or that was the intent. This gentleman's correct. The way our founding fathers set up our government was that each state legislature would send 2 delegates off to New York at the time, or Washington now, and represent the interests of that state. Now, if at any time the legislature felt they were not being properly represented, they could call those legislators back and send new ones. But what that did was assured the states that the state's interests were being represented. By having popularly elected senators now, the senators tend to be more interested in all of the nation and less focused on representing the specific issues of their states. So the states have less power. So that's again a shift away from the small unit toward a stronger central government. The House of Representatives, they truly are elected by popular vote. So if we look at those 4 pages that are in the U.S. Constitution, the whole thing is 4 pages long, how much of that Constitution is dedicated to describing the power and limits of power of our president? 1 page, 1/4 of the whole U.S. Constitution describes the limits of power of the president. When it comes to the Supreme Court, just about 1/3 of a page, maybe even 1/4 of a page, is given to describing the limits of power of the Supreme Court. When it comes to the legislature, 2 full pages describe the powers and, more importantly, the limits of the power of our legislature. So, given this, let me ask you, what do you think was in our founding fathers' minds when they were looking at which is the most powerful branch of our government? The legislature is more powerful. The group that is more powerful would have a shorter tenure. I submit to you that the founding fathers' intent was that the House of Representatives be the most powerful branch, followed by, and hence the shortest tenure, followed by the president, followed by the Senate, and finally the least powerful would be the Supreme Court. But look what's happened over time. As lines have been blurred and people have assumed more and more power, what's happened is our president now, and I'm not talking necessarily about this one, I'm talking over the last 44 presidents, have taken more and more authority for themselves. Now we've got czars and executive orders and the ability to appoint and direct and essentially make edicts past enact laws that are never heard by our elected representatives, never debated on the floor. Our judicial system, our Supreme Court justices rule by case law now instead of rule of law. As a consequence, they are essentially, in many cases, and this is again something we're not going to discuss here, they basically pass laws from the bench that affects us. The House of Representatives still should be the most powerful because they control the pocketbook. So if the president gets us into a war, it should be up to the House of Representatives that doesn't fund it. That is, they would have the power, assumedly, to do that. Now, let me stretch just a moment and connect some more dots that maybe could be connected. Let's go back to our founding fathers and look at their experiences, what experiences they had when they came to the U.S. Do you know what religion most of them were? They came from England. Is that a hint? Most of them were Episcopalians and Anglicans. They came from the Church of England. What kind of church? Well, let me give you the three basic religions that the founding fathers were. Primarily Episcopalian, thank you, you were listening. Episcopalian or Anglican, and also Presbyterian, and then the third largest group were just congregational, what I think of as today non-denominational Christian. So let's look at each of those church groups. An Episcopalian is very much familiar with the strong central figure. The Episcopalian have, I grew up Catholic, so I think of the Pope being the strong central leader. In the Presbyterian church, Presbyterians have different layers of oligarchy, to use this terminology. They've got their sessions and their Presbyterian groups, and then all the way up to the big grand assembly, if I'm using the proper term. So there's multiple layers of government in this oligarchy, and the assumption is that these various church bodies, the elders, have more authority and more knowledge, and are essentially a church oligarchy. And then there's the congregational Christians who really are all independent. So let's compare Episcopalians, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists, and look at how our founding fathers demographically compared. Boy, I'm going to have to go a whole lot faster. 56% of our founding fathers were Episcopalian, Presbyterians 21%, and Congregationalists 23%. Now, that's just of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence. If we expand that population and look at the 204 founding fathers, those that signed the Declaration of Independence, Articles of Confederation, 5 documents, Declaration of Independence, Constitution, and served in the First Continental Congress, there were a total of 204 founding fathers. There's some double counting, like Roger Sherman ended up signing everything. But the numbers come out about the same. 55% of those 204 founding fathers were Episcopalian, 19% were Presbyterians, and 17% were Congregational. So the question I submit to you is, do you suppose that their church upbringing and their familiarity with the church government could have influenced how they created our U.S. Constitution? I suggest that they do. So here's the question. If the government exists to protect our rights, and to protect our rights, our individual rights and our property rights, why, how do I ask this? Under these 3 forms of government, all of your rights come from man. In a republic, our rights come from God. I guess I'm going too fast. I want to ask the question this way. When we signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776, but we didn't officially end the war with England until 1787. We signed a treaty in Paris. 11 years later, King George signed that peace treaty. When King George signed the peace treaty, Samuel Adams said, "Finally, the king has been restored to the throne." Now, what do you suppose he meant by that? I suggest he wasn't talking about King George. What he was referring to is, this is the first time in the history of mankind that a government has been formed that recognized that our rights come from God, not from man. So for the last thousands of years, from the pharaohs to all the way back through all the Caesars and all the Phoenicians and Vikings and Normans and Saxons, all the way through history, whatever rights of property and individual rights came from man. Only in the United States has it ever been recognized that our rights come from God. Today, how many countries are there that recognize that our rights come from God? 2, the United States and Israel. So, when you look at the war between Christians and Muslims, is it any wonder why they want to target Israel and the United States so badly? Because we know our rights come from God. So, in the interest of time here, I'm going to fast forward 235 years. 235 years, fast forward. Now, this is what was given to us. So remember, as Benjamin Franklin left the Constitution Hall, a lady came up to him, have you heard this quote? Came up and said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." So today, these are the issues that we face. We've got Big Bird, gas prices, the environment, the spotted owl, cap and trade, subsidies, China, spotted owl, abortion. These are all the things facing us. Do you see any patterns in any of this? These are all the dots all over the board. These are all issues, but they're like clutter. They're like leaves blowing in the trees, right? All of these issues represent individual leaves, and it looks like a blur to us as all the leaves flutter in the wind. It's hard to make sense of it all. Well, would you believe me if I told you that there's 2 trees there? There's a tree with light green leaves and a tree with dark green leaves. You see, our government today is looking for equal justice and fairness for everybody. We want to redistribute assets from those who have them to those who don't. Well, I submit to you that that's impossible if the job of the government is to protect our property. How can they protect our property while they want to redistribute it? And I notice you've got a beautiful bracelet, and this lady doesn't have one, so I would like you to give your bracelet to her. I direct that. Point is, you can't both redistribute and protect your rights of property. They're mutually exclusive. So, big deal. What are the consequences of this? Let me tell you where this would go. Have any of you ever been to Washington, D.C. and gone to the Holocaust Museum? A couple of you have? You've been to Israel also. Excellent. Well, then you can validate what I say here. I'm going to condense this. If you walk through the Holocaust Museum, there's kind of a circuitous trail they take you on, and as you go through each of the displays and exhibits, you see all of man's humanity to man. By the time you leave there, there's no doubt that the Holocaust happened, and a lot of people suffered. But is there anywhere in the museum that answers the question, why? Why did Hitler do that? How did one man convince a whole country to turn on other human beings? Let me submit an idea to you. Hitler believed in the work of Charles Darwin. Hitler believed in evolution. Remember, Hitler was looking for the ultimate race. In order to build the ultimate race, you have to weed out all of the defective people, the weak ones, the ugly ones. If you may remember in the museum that there's actually calipers for measuring noses, this ratio to this ratio, and if you didn't fit a particular ratio, off you got on the train. And then after a while it was, well, just get all the gypsies, and by the heck, just get all the Jews. And what Hitler was doing was looking to breed the ultimate race, because there's no morality. It's all about survival of the fittest. Now, off on the plains of the Serengeti, where the lion attacks the gazelle, those are what the rules are. The gazelle's rights end when when the lions outrun him. So out in those wilds, it is the strongest survive. There's no morality, primarily because there's no God. Man gives us rights, and man can retract those rights. So if I were to loan you my car, would it be reasonable for me to say, I need this car back by midnight, or I don't want you to leave the county? We would expect that because the one who grants the rights also has the authority to put limits on the rights. If I were to come to the Covenant Village and say, I'm going to give you $10 million, do you suppose I could get a facility here to change the name from Berg Hall to Thompson Hall? If not, I don't know how much Mr. Berg donated, but I bet I could at least get the... Miss Berg, okay. I bet that I could get Thompson Dessert Bar in the cafeteria with a large enough donation. The point is, when you control or you dictate or control the rights, you can control the use as well. So in the Soviet Union, they have a Bill of Rights. They have freedom of speech as prescribed by law, freedom of assembly as prescribed by law, freedom of religion as prescribed by law, because all of those rights come from the government, not from God. So let's look at Lenin, another example. Lenin ran the Soviet Union for many years. Now, he knew that he did not need large numbers. He didn't want large numbers of people. He just wanted a select few people to build a dictatorship of the proletariat, a dictatorship of the elite. And he only wanted a small percentage of people who really understood abstract politics. Lenin believed that a small minority of leftist intellectuals was all that was necessary to take over the world. So we think of the old USSR as a communist country, but do you know what percentage of the population were actually communist? About 7%. Lenin knew that all he needed was a small number and he could control the masses. Socialism is an elitist intellectual movement, and they believe, quote, the masses are asses. In America, though, we're different, right? We don't have just 7% making all the rules. Well, you've heard the old adage, put your money where your mouth is. That actually tells a good story. The average American will happily spend $50 to $100 out on a nice dinner, but if you ask them to contribute $25 to a political campaign, you'd think they were being asked to pay off the national debt. Less than 2% of all the nation's registered voters actually contribute to some sort of a political campaign. Now, California is considered a very active state, and yet it's just a very minute percentage of the population actually participate. And it's even a smaller percentage if you look at the population that's actually registered to vote. You see, activists produce the candidates, and then everybody else as voters has to pick somebody that's already been selected for them. So are we not an oligarchy ruled by that small active few? Let me give you another example. A few years ago in California, this is 1966, in the area of just south of San Francisco, the Democrats controlled the House. So what the Democrats in California did was redistricted the state, so they put all the Republicans in one district. So there's one district that had 600,000 people, 400,000 were eligible to vote, 235,000 of those actually registered to vote, and only 120,000 actually were active voters. Of those, because of the redistricting, this district became a primarily Republican district. So what we knew was that whatever Republican won in the primary, he would also win in the general election. So there were 70,000 registered Republicans and 50,000 registered Democrats. In the race, there were 8 candidates in the primary. The guy that won, H.L. Richardson, remember Bill Richardson? He won because he got 16,000 votes. His next closest competitor got 10,000. So you know whoever won the primary would end up winning the general. He won by what was considered a landslide victory of 6,000 votes out of a community of 600,000. That's 1%. So is this unique to just this one time? No. Richardson wrote the book Confrontational Politics, so that's the one that I can speak from some authority on. But I can tell you that this type of thing happens all the time. So how do they do it? How do they, those who are less conservative than us, break us apart and get their way? You see, what they've been doing is dividing us in order to conquer us. The tactic that they use is to divide us into small groups. What we've been looking at is the whole big picture, and I think that's not the right way to go. Liberals, on the other hand, would claim all the lumberjacks, and they would also claim all the environmentalists. And yet, wouldn't these two groups be diametrically opposed if you put them in the same room? Construction workers, all the SEIU, union workers, etc., would be put against the anti-growth people, and yet the anti-growth people and the union people would still think of both of themselves, would consider themselves to be liberal or progressive, and yet these groups would be diametrically opposed, as would the law enforcement unions, the trial lawyers, and the ACLU, those that arrest the people and those that let them go. Kind of like fish and game, isn't it? Catch and release. The way that we have been eroded, that is, the reason that power has been taken away from the individuals and the family and the churches, more and more authority is given to the government because we allow it. Because we're looking at the leaves on the tree, and the leaves on the tree may say spotted owl, and we say, oh, of course we're for the spotted owl, because we're compassionate. Well, if you recall, the issue with the spotted owl wasn't about the spotted owl at all. There was no shortage of spotted owls. That was a false issue put up. Why? To take control of land. It was to give more power to the government. Land control. Every other issue that we see on that flip chart I showed you earlier comes down to one of two branches. See, this tree really does have two branches. If we turn it and look at it from our counterintelligence eyes and look at the tree from the side, we see that there are two branches on this tree. Everything, every political issue can be condensed into one branch or the other. And that it would be, is there a God or is there no God? If there's a God, then the God is the one who granted us our rights. And only God can take away those rights. If there is no God, then our rights come from man. If there's no God, then we weren't created, we evolved. If we evolved, then there's no morality. If I can outrun you, outthink you, outfox you, or defeat you, I can conquer you. So if you have something that I want, I can take it. And there's no morality, no issues. There's not even any issues about telling lies or half-truths. And half-truths are one of the biggest tools that the I don't want to use the term liberal because that's too confining. Let's say those who don't believe in a in a God would use, because lying is not only okay, but it would be encouraged, because to lie to get your way would be something that would be more honorable. So on one side we've got godlessness, evolution, survival of the fittest, no consequences, man granted rights. Instead of God creating man, we have a philosophy that says man created God. And something that I've read is man who is weak and had an innate character defect had to create a God to fill some internal void in their structure. But it's a weakness. Say it again. It's Sun Tzu said, "Know your enemy." So I've read the Quran as well because they didn't sell me on it, but I want to know how the other side thinks. That's part of being a good counterintelligence agent. So if you believe that there's no God, then you can tax, you can steal, you can replace religion with philosophy, you can replace Easter with an Easter egg. Spring break, that's all that Easter's good for now. What you would want to do is get God out of the courtroom, get God out of the classroom, introduce drugs, have a whole culture that says, do as you please, do as you want. So if I were Satan, those are all the things that I would do. Half-truths. Remember Bill Clinton saying, "I did not have sexual relations with that woman"? Well, technically, he never really had sex, right? All he did was put a cigar in her vagina, right? That's not really sex, so it's kind of splitting hairs. Remember Bill Clinton saying it depends on what the definition of is? That's all what's called secular humanism. We don't have individual salvation, we have collective salvation. So when it comes down to voting, and I know I'm speeding here because I'm watching the clock for your, to respect your time. When it comes to voting on political issues, what I hope none of you do is say things that I've heard are, "I don't like that Sarah Palin because of that gotcha," or "I didn't like a particular candidate because he wears cowboy boots with a suit," or that Michelle Bachmann takes small steps, even though she's only 5'2". Rather than when I hear people say, "Well, I don't vote on the party, I vote on the person," let me suggest to you that what you should do is take every element and trace it back to one branch on this tree or the other. Everything, even high-speed rail, comes down to one side of this tree or the other. Now you might ask, what does high-speed rail, bicycle paths have to do with anything? This is a whole other subject for another 6-hour talk. There's something called Agenda 21. Are any of you familiar with Agenda 21? Okay. High-speed rail is designed to connect major cities, major population centers together. So the idea behind high-speed rail is to have a large population center, say in the LA area, in San Francisco area, connected with high-speed rail, because the idea is to control the population in the major population centers. And there's many steps in between, but it's part of collective salvation, one world government, controlling the population. Now, before you decide that I'm a conspiracy nut and I'm making this stuff up, don't take it from me. Go to Google or Yahoo, look up Agenda 21 and see what it says. Agenda 21 is something organized by the United Nations, and the goal is one world government. One world government means everybody is equal. And when these Occupy Wall Street people are talking about the 1% that should have their stuff taken from them and distributed to the other 99, what they fail to realize is that all of us in America are the top 1%. And the goal behind Agenda 21 is to take from all of us, middle class and poor in America, and redistribute globally to bring everybody to the same level. So what I encourage you to do is really know the issues, and don't be persuaded by things like the spotted owl or save the forests, or usually it's sugar-coated in some way like pro-choice. Of course you want to have choices. Or what are some of the other good ones? You're not for women's health. Nobody would want to be against women's health. You would be construed as, you know, push grandma off the cliff kind of person. But let me give you, I'm going to end here, leave you with some of these thoughts. Right now on the surface of Mars, now you're thinking, where is he going with this one? Okay, we're going to connect all the dots here. On the surface of Mars right now, there's 3 rovers looking for signs of life. What do you suppose would happen if one of those rovers found some microbial single-celled amoeba? Headlines around the world would say, life discovered on Mars. What a magnificent news that would be. However, woman is 8.5 months pregnant. That fetus can be aborted because it's not really life yet. It was more analogous to a tumorous mass, right? It might have a brains and heart and fingers and be moving, but it's not really born. Therefore, we redefine the terms because under secular humanism, our morals change to fit the situation. Our morals evolve. So I would encourage you not to be a secular humanist, but to keep your roots in only one spot. You're going to